come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the 81 All Out podcast. I'm Sidhu and I'm joined by two very special guests today. We have K. Balakumar, who is also K. Balakumar on Twitter. You can follow him. He's a veteran journalist based in Chennai. He has worked for publications like News Time and is an avid cricket fan, and he's also a cricket reporter for many years. And joining us from Sydney is Vijay Arumugam, another passionate cricket fan, probably one of the biggest fans of Sachin Tendulkar in the world, after me, that is, of course. And Vijay has joined us on the podcast before. And thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining again, guys.
Hello. Hi. Nice to be here.
Not a problem, Sid. Anytime.
Here we're talking today, we're continuing our build up to the 2019 World Cup by going back. Today we're going back all the way to 1987. We're more than a long way back, so to speak, back to the era of black and white, if you want to look at it that way. It was a very interesting World Cup. It was the first World Cup held outside England. It was also historic because both India and Pakistan hosted the World Cup for the first time. And in many ways, it was an administrative coup of sorts for the subcontinent to be hosting it. And one could say that it was the starting point of where cricket has eventually landed up in the economic sense. I mean, now the subcontinent is the economic center, and 87 and 86 and 87, those years were probably the early parts of this story. So let me bring in my guests here. I'd like to start off by just talking about where you were in 87, where were you in your life, and how did you follow this World Cup? And, maybe one or two personal memories from it, not necessarily from the games itself, but from your own life and maybe where you watched a particular game or one striking memory from it. If you can start off. Bala.
See, at 87, I was in the first year of my college. I studied in Trichy, and I hail from Madurai. Between Madurai and Trichinopoli, it's hardly 2.5 hours drive. So bulk of the matches I watched in Madurai, actually. A lot of friends had come down from different places. So we get bunched together. We all used to get in one of our friends' places, watch the matches together. So that started our cricket camaraderie, because back in Madurai at those times, cricket on television was slowly starting. The first really thing was 1985, we had watched that World Series, World Championship of Cricket in 1985, which we won. So that 85 was our first initiation into cricket television watching. 87, since it happened in India, there was much more interest, and since India was started to go all the way till the finals, which eventually didn't happen. That's a separate story. And we were all hoping that India would be doing well, and that's how we started watching those matches. But after the first match itself, we were slightly downcast. But after that first match, the next 5 matches we won on the trot. So that was special. So those were the initial memories.
Wonderful. And what about you, Vijay?
Thanks, Sid. So this is Vijay Arumugam. So in 1987, I was 10-year-old and I was in the school. So we used to live in a small South Indian town called Thoothukudi. It's also known as Tuticorin. So that's pretty much close to Sri Lanka than anywhere else. So I was in my school and cricket was pretty much crazy over there. And 1987 World Cup really, really captured the imagination of the country, so to speak. So I still remember we used to talk at school. Everywhere it was in the press, and especially as Bala talked about, the early games were really, really close and exciting, and suddenly you felt everyone was talking about cricket and everyone was watching. I also traveled a few times to my hometown Sivakasi during the tournament, and even there, like, when the game was on, even if it was a daytime, people would pretty much try to get close to a TV and watch the games. And, and also the other interesting thing, the school where I studied was a 5-minute bicycle ride away from the home, which meant we used to come home for lunch, and so we used to watch a fair bit of cricket during the lunch. I still remember the game was, I think, the second game in India-New Zealand in Bangalore. We were in dire straits, and Kapil and Kiran More rescued us from a very tricky situation. In that game, I still remember coming back home and for lunch and watching a fair bit of it, and then watching a bit of New Zealand innings before going back to school and then coming home as well. So it was my first a multi-nation tournament. Although the 1986 Asian Games happened in Seoul in South Korea a year before, and I think we also had the World Table Tennis Championships in New Delhi in 1987, which was big as well. But this was a really, really first big event, a multinational event, and that too, as Bala said, was hosted in India, and it was exciting. The other thing, all the other tournaments, I was too young when 83 happened, and 83 was always known as the Prudential Cup based on the sponsor in the UK. But 87, for some reason, it just got to be remembered, or even at that time, as the Reliance Cup. So we talk so much about sponsorship, we talk so much about the commercial aspects of the game. Even back then, it wasn't called as the World Cup. The reason why I'm saying that 1996, 9 years later, when India hosted, when cricket was a much bigger economy, it was a Wills World Cup, but I hardly heard anyone talking about it as the Wills World Cup, or even the 2011, by then ICC had taken over. It was the ICC Cricket World Cup. But 87 had that distinct Reliance Cup. It was more than a World Cup, it was a Reliance Cup. And I still remember that, that particular way in which that phrase was used, and it became such a popular thing. And the other interesting thing was we had only a black and white TV. I remember for one of the games, we were in a hometown, we were at someone's house, and they had a color TV. So I pretty much watched the whole tournament, pretty much every game on black and white. The other striking thing was the highlights, because most games were day games. I mean, not most, all games were day games. So we used to get the nightly highlights. And ML Jayasinghe, the former Indian cricket player, or Tiger Pataudi, the former Indian captain, they used to host the highlights package. I still remember distinctly some of the comments they made. So it was good because the Sports Star, which was the magazine from the newspaper Hindu, so they used to cover it regularly, and the Indian Express and the Hindu were the main two newspapers. So it was everywhere in the print as well as on TV, albeit a black and white one. But the World Cup in 87 was really big. And I still remember, and when I think about it, though it's many, many years ago, I still have a lot of fond memories of the tournament.
There was one article I distinctly remember from India Today. The article was about the commercial aspects of the Reliance World Cup. The introduction was where they quote Anil Ambani, one of the top directors of Reliance Textiles. He was the man behind the whole show. And the story starts off saying that we are talking about World Cup, and Anil immediately interjects and says, "What World Cup? This is Reliance Cup." I think it was written by Raj Shengappa, who is now the editor. And you could see it almost everywhere. That was the first time cricket was being hard sold in India. And they went after it like hell. I mean, Reliance pulled out all stops to get that going. It was
very interesting. So one question I wanted to ask you in this regard is between 1983 and 1987, just anecdotally and also from the feel that you got, did you feel that, in those 4 years, cricket really became a much bigger sport, a mass sport? And did that 1983 win really widen the wings, so to speak, of the game in India?
Yes, most certainly I would say, because after 1983, we had 1985. And that was the first time we were exposed to the Australian coverage. Australian coverage was very important for cricket to develop in India in terms of television. That was the first time we got to see top-notch cricket coverage. And you had the legends like Richie Benaud and Bill Lowry, and early morning cricket coverage. That's 1985 really started it. And we also had 86. In 86 and 87, we went to Australia. And those Benson Hedges tournament, which we went to the finals, we didn't win. It was a tri-nation, India, Australia, and New Zealand. And that particular tournament was also well remembered. And we also had that Rothmans Cup, which we won in Sharjah immediately after 1985. Famously, Gavaskar won a man of the match for his fielding effort.
Wasn't that the tournament where Pakistan were bowled out for 120 odd and India then?
No,
I mean, the
India was other way around.
125 and 87, yes.
Yes,
exactly. And that was immediately after 85, immediately after Melbourne. India didn't come back from Melbourne to India straight away. We went to Sharjah and then came back to India. That was the tournament, and Gavaskar, the first match, he won for 4 catches, man of the match, which was unique at the time. So cricket really took off from that point. And 86, 87, we got to see India in Australia, though we didn't do well, both in Test. We drew that series, if I remember, because Gavaskar scored 2 centuries. But
yeah, it was a draw.
It was a draw, and one-day internationals, we managed to go into the finals, but we didn't win the finals. 0-2 we lost. But that particular period really set it up, and we also had the tight test in between in India.
In Madras.
So, in Madras, after that. So, and we also, in between, Australia also to India for one-day series, if I remember. So that was telecast pretty much, and that really kindled the spirit for one-day internationals in India in terms of cricket watching.
So I'm trying to understand, because I've been seeing a few videos from the 70s and even 60s. And even back then, I mean, the test matches were so packed and jam-packed. I mean, talking about India, West Indies, 74, 75. So when you mean it took off, are you also talking about the takeoff from the television perspective, going into smaller towns and villages and people getting introduced to it?
Television was a big thing because, Sid, till the 80s, it was radio and it was newspaper. You have the very famous image, right? Outside the Hindu offices in Madras or in Chennai now. So people used to go in their bicycles and wait outside and watch the live scorecards being updated, right? Because Hindu used to have their own scoreboard when India used to play test matches overseas or especially in India. So the access was a big problem. So the 83 changed it. And as Bala talked about, 1982 Asian Games brought in the color TV. So people were able to get TV sets at homes or in a few homes, and that started to revolutionize. And also, very interestingly, till the 80s, India as a BCCI as a cricket board and India as a cricket team were very, very test match centric. I wish that was the case now, because now we're so much into T20 and one-day cricket. India as a team, as a board, they were so test match centric. Just to let you know, India had never gone to Australia, or India were never invited to Australia to participate in a tri-series as a tri-series team. Only when India used to tour Australia as a test series, we used to participate in a tri-series. So we were a test match nation. Crowds used to watch test cricket, but 83 kind of changed it. And as Bala talked about the champions of champions in 85, and in fact, I remember the Rothmans Cup, the game he talked about, the 125 India and 87 Pakistan. Iftikhar Ahmed, the Pakistan commentator, Imran, he took 6 wickets, right? 6 for 14 in that game. When he dismissed Ravi Sastry for none, and Iftikhar said, and Imran has dismissed him, and the champions of champions has gone for a duck. That's how Iftikhar Ahmed, the partisan Pakistani commentator, said back then. So, but again, in between, again, one other point, historically, 83 and 85, India weren't a great team. As Bala talked about, when the Australians came for the Ranji Trophy 100th year celebrations in 1984, we were a pretty poor side. Even England beat us a lot at home in 84-85. So the results didn't matter, but the people started to feel that India could hit sixes. I still remember Sunny Gavaskar writing about, ever since you win the World Cup, second over, third over, people started to ask for sixes in the ground. So the expectation of the people from just India competing in a test match and defending or drawing versus India can win. I think that belief, self-belief, and the advent of TV were the two factors.
One of the things I want to ask you people is, and maybe Bala can start off, is that perhaps it was the first World Cup where there was no absolutely outright favorite, because West Indies were in a kind of a rebuilding phase. Many of the main West Indies players didn't come, especially the fast bowlers. Marshall and Holding and Garner. And Richards was captaining, Lloyd had retired, and, even people like Carl Hooper were coming up. So would you say that it was the first open World Cup?
Yeah, that was the case, but it was also believed that India and Pakistan would somehow make it to the finals. That was built up. Build as the final would be between Pakistan and India. But it was certainly an open World Cup, and Australia were never in the picture in the run-up to the World Cup. None of those, we didn't have this kind of countdown or series of articles. I don't remember reading, there were articles, general articles, but I don't remember these kind of segmented specific articles in the run-up to the World Cup. But in what little that we read, or at least I read, Australia was not mentioned, and it was a pretty open World Cup.
But I don't agree to the fact it was an open World Cup. There was one favorite, that was Pakistan. There was daylight, and the rest. So the whole humbug was India versus Pakistan was built up in India based on delusion, because Pakistan had come to India, beaten India in a test series. They had gone to England. They had beaten England in a test series. Imran was making those statements. I want to beat India in India, England in England. I want to win the World Cup. So Imran had those goals, great captain. They had a much better bowling attack and a very strong batting lineup. They were the easy favorites. And I still remember, I don't exactly remember the English journalist who wrote that particular piece. This is before Ted Corbett, I believe. He clearly stated that Pakistan are favorites. India will reach the finals and lose to Pakistan at Eden Gardens. It was that kind of a prediction. But yes, Bala was right. There was a lot of feelings in India amongst the regional press and others. It was a hope that we would love to see an India-Pakistan final at the Eden Gardens. Because even few months prior to that, Pakistan came to India for a 6-match one-day series. They won 5-1. And I vaguely remember a game in Pune when Wasim Akram was unplayable. Sunil Gavaskar, Srikanth were like playing out of memory. Everyone, right? So they were the favorites. And again, one other point, West Indies, I think this is something I want to highlight, right? Because England players and Australian players get a lot of flack when they skip India. Like Bala mentioned, Ian Botham and David Gavaskar or Richard Hadley. But we are somehow cutting a lot of slack to West Indies players. Malcolm Marshall and Gordon Greenwich were tired within ports to tour India, and they didn't tour India for the World Cup. So, yes, Joel Garner had retired, Clive Lloyd had retired, they were in a rebuilding phase. But a couple of prima donnas, Malcolm Marshall and Gordon Greenwich, were too tired or they were not bothered to come to India. So somehow West Indies players are not questioned or challenged the amount of scrutiny we put on the English and Australian players. So yes, Vivian Richards had a side which was going through a bit of a rebuilding phase. And Australia, I agree with Bala, were they were like not just the retirements of Greg Chappell and others, they also were badly stung by all these, the South African rebel tours, so they had lost a lot of players. So it was India-Pakistan, with Pakistan being the favorites and West Indies were the other ones. And no one thought highly of New Zealand. And also the other factor was most of the games India played in India and Pakistan played all the games, but some of the games from Pool B, the other pool, happened in India as well. So I think the advantage that mostly you play in front of the crowds and the pitches were favorable to you. So you expected the home teams, the two subcontinental teams, to go through the finals. That was the expectation.
Yeah, in many ways it was like the 96 World Cup as well, right? Because Group A happened pretty much in India, I think probably all in India, and Group B happened mostly in Pakistan except for like a few games. So for me personally, I was too young, but it seemed like the Group B seemed like games I was just hearing about and not really watching too much of. Maybe I saw some highlights of it, but most of my memories are from Group A. I don't know if it was because of TV coverage or what about you guys? Do you remember watching all of Group B as well?
Not all the matches. I was in college, so I couldn't watch all the matches. But personally speaking, I felt the coverage from Pakistan television was much better because it was between PTV and Doordarshan. They had split it. When they won when Doordarshan decided to telecast, there was a lot of problems running into the World Cup. Doordarshan said it was not ready to cover it, and there were a lot of issues. And government, then again, Rajiv Gandhi had to interfere, and finally the coverage had to go through. And Doordarshan, at that time it was talked of very highly in the sense they were going to cover this match with 4 or even 6 cameras for the telecast. And Doordarshan had also had a specialist flown from BBC, and they had a session in Bangalore that was widely reported at that time. And Doordarshan talked of its coverage pretty highly. But actually, when my remembrance of the telecast was Pakistan television's coverage was far better than Doordarshan's. If I remember, sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry.
So Bala is right. Sid, there are a couple of things, right? Yes. So I think to come back to your first question about that, you said the first ever game between India and Australia. That was the second game, because the first ever game was between Pakistan and Sri Lanka in Group B from Hyderabad, Sindh. Okay, this is the second game, but I'll give you an important point. That day we had another equally interesting. Those days they used to have 2 games. So England played West Indies.
Gujranwala.
It was a great game because it was, what we used to do, the India-Australia game was the second game, or the game on our side. It was televised, but in between they used to go for a few, they used to call it a grandstanding telecast, and they used to take you to the Gujranwala game and show it. But in the evening, we used to get highlights from both the games, and the PTV presenters will present the highlights from that game. The Doordarshan commentators used to do it. So in those days, used to have, simultaneous games happening. So probably we didn't get to see the whole game. So that's again the point. The day when we had the Madras game between India and Australia, the Gujranwala game was a great game, and Allan Lamb tore into Courtney Walsh and won a very, very close game, which was unthinkable. I think he pretty much scored 91 runs of the last 10 overs or so. So I think, Sid, that's another point. And I completely agree with Bala in terms of the coverage, because despite having a BBC expert, Doordarshan coverage is poor. And also, very importantly, I think the Hindu or the Sportstar, they used to send KP Morgan. I think he was the athletics correspondent. He covered all the Pakistani games. And he used to write tour diaries. It was fascinating back in 87, reading the tour diaries from Pakistan from an Indian perspective. And he used to say, in those days in India, we used to have trunk calls. I don't know if anyone remembers those. Like, trunk calls means you used to put a request into a telephone exchange, and the operator will call you back and then connect you with somebody, and you have to choose time. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, whatever. But in those days, apparently in Pakistan, KP Mohan used to, they could call people directly from Lahore to Karachi, or Karachi to Islamabad, or whatever. And that facility and telex facilities were available in the press boxes in Pakistan, while in India, to submit a report or telephone facilities were absolutely abysmal. He said, working in Indian press boxes to Pakistani press boxes, like chalk and cheese. And then Bala was right. The visuals were much better. And that was the case even throughout the 80s. Rupavahini from Sri Lanka, PTV from Pakistan were much better than Doordarshan in terms of the quality, production, edit, as well as the, even the commentators, I would say. I agree with Bala on that.
And talking about that match that you brought up, the England-West Indies match, I think Allan Lamb had also gone after Bruce Reid a few months before, right? In the final over.
Sydney, yes.
Yeah, he was in quite a purple patch of form in that during that time.
Yeah, certainly, because that particular Sydney match was terrific. He took 18 runs of the final over of Bruce Reid. He finished off in 5 balls with 1 ball to spare, if I remember right. And this was pretty much like Dhoni that we see of late. See, as Vijay pointed out, it was around 90 odd runs in the last 10 overs and 31 or 32 runs in the last 3 overs. That was right up Allan Lamb's alley. But remember, he just had the tail he had a good partnership with Embure, then with De Freitas. He finished it off with Neil Foster. Neil Foster, in fact, he hit the winning runs. But at that time, Courtney Walsh had the first 2 matches among the first 3 matches, one against Pakistan and one against, this was the first match for West Indies, and he was all over the place in the final over. He had 4 wides, he had a no ball, he had an awful tournament. But Lamb, throughout he was very pivotal for England in the 1985 series, and after that, that particular match you referred to, in fact, I still remember at the time that match was not telecast in India, but they showed the final over in one of those news, one of the Doordarshan news. I still remember he was not standing in one place. That was unique because we were used to seeing cricketers standing, their stance being stable. He was going around. That was pretty interesting. And he did pretty much similar against Walsh in the final over.
Yeah, so Sid, I think very interesting you brought about you brought up the topic of Allan Lamb, right? Because Allan Lamb, the first time I saw him was 1984 when England toured India. He was considered a bit of a suspect against spin bowling. Shivaramakrishnan had him in a bit of few knots, but he was an excellent player of fast bowling, being a South African descent, right? So Lamb had, as Bala pointed out, I remember watching the highlights of that Sydney game, the 85 Bruce Street game, back on Rupavahini, the Sri Lankan Rupavahini. They used to show games from the Benson and Edges. And Bala was right. He used to move around a lot. And he was very, very a pioneering one in terms of moving around and making the bowlers bowl to where he wanted them to bowl or used to get the room and all. And the Gujranwala, the other interesting thing about Gujranwala, John Embury scored some good runs. And more importantly, Philip de Freitas. You could see these signs, right? Because a few months before that, during the English summer, when Pakistan toured England, they played 3 games they used to call the Texaco Trophy games. The third game was a very close game. I forgot it was probably Edgbaston. I don't know exactly the ground. I think it was a 213 or something Pakistan scored. When England were chasing, Philip de Freitas came and scored a very quick 33 or 32 not out. And I remember watching that in one of the TV news reels back then. And it was same repeat, like a few months later, the World Cup. And Philip de Freitas played some, bold shots. And I think Bala's read Neil Foster finished off the game. It wasn't Lamb who hit the winning runs, it was Neil Foster who hit the winning runs. So Allan Lamb had the bit of the pedigree in those days to finish off games and to be sort of a finisher. Finisher is a word that's a bit of a misnomer because I don't think there's anyone called a finisher. He was a good player when it comes to the final overs and get some good runs of the quicker bowlers. And as Bala said, Courtney Walsh had an absolute shocker. Patrick Patterson was good, but Walsh was, I think they badly missed Malcolm Marshall. Malcolm Marshall was badly and sorely missed by West Indies in the tournament for experience.
Did they have, so they had Anthony Gray, right, as the other bowler?
Anthony Gray, I don't remember. They have Winston
Benjamin. Yeah. And I think Baptist was Eldon Baptist was
Eldon
there.
Ashford Baptist,
Baptist was there. Gray, I don't think Tony Gray, right? Tony Gray, I think he played in the Sharjah tournament in 85-86. I don't remember Gray bowling in the World Cup.
I think Gray was in the squad, but he probably didn't play. But talking about Walsh and that horror tournament he had, he still went back with a award from the Pakistan government for not mankading Salim Jafar in that match. That was a huge moment at that time, right? I remember, again, my granddad was talking about it for a long time. Everyone was talking about Walsh doing that. He could have easily mankaded him, but he sort of gave him a bit of a warning. And was that big then?
Yeah, it was talked of very highly because he actually did. I don't know whether you know AVM Saravanan, who has AVM Saravanan, Tamil film producer, who has a way of folding his arm. Actually, Walsh did that. He folded his arms. He didn't mankad Salim Jafar. He didn't exactly warn. He didn't say anything. He just folded his arms. And at the time, while watching, we were not really sure what was happening. So only after the commentator explained, we kind of understood what was happening. And it was a huge thing. And as you're right, Pakistan government gave him this special prize. It was a carpet. It was a carpet. And a long time after, I read a report of Martin Johnson. He had specifically mentioned last year, Courtney Walsh was trying to fly home on that carpet. Because that was a typical Englishman. Because India and Pakistan was seen as a land of magic carpets and typical, from an Englishman's perspective. So
I think the other joke was that had Walsh actually gone ahead and mankaded Salim Jafar and West Indies had won the match, then he would have needed a carpet to get out of that ground.
Exactly.
Yeah, I said I vaguely, sorry, I didn't say wrong choice of the not vaguely. I fully remember watching that game because Abdul Qadir had hit a 6 of him. And then I think they required 2 of the last ball, and Jafar was a few, not inches, few feet away. And as he rightly pointed out, I'm not sure about AVM Saravanan, but it was like it was one of those poses, right, when he had both the arms linked close to the chest. And then he was fairly nervous, and he kind of warned him and walked away. What really I remember from that game was, because West Indies had lost the first game in Gujranwala with Allan Lamb smoking Walsh. This was the second game. The problem for West Indies was England and Pakistan and West Indies were the three strong teams, and Sri Lanka was the fourth one. Everyone would beat Sri Lanka those days. But having lost to Pakistan and England and this Pakistan game, Vivian Richards was staring at a very difficult task. So when the winning runs were hit and the camera moved to Vivian Richards, who was the covers, who was on his back. I mean, he was completely exhausted. He was on his back, eyes closed. And there was a poignant moment because he was a great captain, great champion. And he knew that that was the moment, probably and possibly, West Indies lost the opportunity to get to the semi-finals. And I mean, I don't know what the reaction was back then in terms of the Walsh and his behavior. But you're right, I think they gave him a sportsman award. Ziaul Haq, the then Pakistan president, he gave him a medal or medallion. Yes, the carpet story was also correct. So it was pretty big in the press and in terms of being sportsperson. But nowadays, people would debate whether it's sporting or whether that robbed West Indies of an opportunity to seal a semi-final spot in a World Cup tournament.
But
just to clarify, this was West Indies' third match because they had played the second match against Sri Lanka, 360 for 4.
Where Richards
181. Okay. That was the second.
Maybe I'm wrong because I still, you could be right. I haven't checked, but I was under the impression they lost the Gujranwala, they lost this, then the Karachi game happened. Maybe you're right. I mean, maybe in between they played that the 360.
I don't know. I'm just also saying this from my mind. I don't know.
Okay.
Talking of Zia-ul-Haq, that was very interesting. Sorry to interject. See, Zia-ul-Haq, now that you have brought up Zia-ul-Haq, Zia-ul-Haq was very instrumental in this World Cup coming to India and Pakistan in a strange manner. Because in 1980, this is totally off tangent, this is not about cricket. In 1986, there was a lot of border skirmish between India and Pakistan. So again, England and Australia raised security concerns and they said they may not want to tour India and Pakistan for the World Cup. So the tensions had to be brought down and India and Pakistan had to show that somehow there were not many problems between the country. So Zia-ul-Haq, he made an impromptu trip to India in 1987 and sometime in January or February for the Jaipur test, when India and Pakistan were playing this 5-match test series, which we lost 0-1, as Vijay pointed out earlier. So Zia-ul-Haq came to India impromptu. That sent out the signals that things were pretty okay between India and Australia, and the tensions were cooling off, and that was what helped Australia and England to make up their minds to travel to India and Pakistan for the World Cup.
I think Bala is right. Sid, Bala is right, because I think this is called as Operation Brass Tacks. This was the war games that were getting played out in the Rajasthan deserts in 86, 87. And it was one of those tense moments, and Bala is right, both England and Australia expressed concerns. I think there is one more story before that, because the three protagonists who brought the World Cup to India, Inderjit Singh Bindra and Jagmohan Dalmia, they had a meeting in Murray in the hill town of Pakistan. And I think that topic was brought up saying, how do we break the ice? I think Zia-ul-Haq or probably the Pakistan cricket chairman, those they were called the BCCP, Noor Khan, Air Marshal Noor Khan, I believe, BCCP they were known as. I think that was expressed to them saying that this is a problem. And in that, it was Inderjit Singh Bindra who told Zia-ul-Haq, why can't he come and visit India for a cricket game? And he took that invitation, he showed up for the Jaipur test. And that Jaipur test, and if I'm right, Lala Amarnath, the first Indian captain, or the former Indian captain, he was the one who was seated next to him to explain the intricacies or the nuances of the game. And Bala is right. I think that broke the ice, and India and Pakistan kind of realized war wasn't an option, and they went back to their bases, and then the Cricket World Cup was conducted in a smooth manner.
Wasn't this the Jaipur test where Gavaskar got out first ball?
Exactly.
Yes,
Yeah, so
yes,
I
yes.
think there was even a cartoon I remember which said that Gavaskar got out even before Ziaul Haq could enter the stadium or something like that. So it was
Yes, there was something to that effect.
yeah, because
Yes.
they were trying to do a pun on his walkout against Lily in Australia, as if he was walking out against Zia as well. So
Yeah, I think the craze was Sunil Gavaskar was very close to the 10,000th run, right? So this was the test match, third test match after the Madras and the Eden Gardens test. So this is the third test match in Jaipur, and Sunny couldn't get there, and he got it in the next test match in Ahmedabad. Maybe it would have been a little more historic had Ziaul Haq been there and had Sunny Gavaskar got the 10,000th run in Jaipur, but it wasn't to be. And as you're right, I mean, I think he was the only batsman, if I'm right, who got out to the first ball of a test match 3 times. I could be wrong. I think 3 times he got out to the Imran and probably Malcolm Marshall and Michael Holding once. I think 3 times, first ever ball of a test match he got out.
yeah, and talking about Sunny, I mean, it was pretty clear. I was just going back and reading a few reports then, and everyone, the general sentiment seemed to be that both Imran and Sunny would pretty much retire after this World Cup. I mean, and they were saying how the two legends of the game from India and Pakistan, it'll be their last World Cup, and then they were tying it in with the fact that if India and Pakistan play in Eden Gardens, it'll be a fitting farewell and things. So, but Sunny didn't really do much in the World Cup, right? I mean, apart from maybe one knock or...
No. If I remember, he had a decent, in fact, he ended up as the top scorer for India throughout the series. He had a century at Nagpur and he had 250s. He had a, decent World Cup by his one-day standards, if I remember right. And that century at Nagpur was brilliant. I mean, it was very un-Gavaskar-like innings. But the seeds of that knock was perhaps sown in 1986. Again, we had to go back to Brisbane, where we chased around 250 odd against New Zealand. Gavaskar opened and went after Evan Chatfield. 27. He scored just 27, but of 17 balls. That was the first time we actually saw Gavaskar in a practically un-Gavaskar-like batting. He had a 6, he had 3, he hit him for 17 runs or something in one Evan Chatfield over. So he, again in Nagpur, he went after Evan Chatfield, and that was the fastest, at that time it was the fastest century in the World Cup. And it was not alone, not just for the fact that it was the fastest century, there was plenty of needle between Gavaskar and Kapil Dev before that match. The previous match was against Zimbabwe, if I remember right, and it all boiled down to net run rate. And Kapil Dev felt that Gavaskar, he had 50 of 100 on what balls, 110 or 112 balls. Gavaskar had a 50 in that match. He didn't exactly name Gavaskar, but he said the team should have gone pretty fast, knowing fully well that the entire semi-final thing is going to be decided on the net run rate. So, because we were chasing 190 odd against Zimbabwe, and we got it around perhaps in 40 or 40 odd overs. I don't exactly remember that. But I remember Gavaskar getting a 50 in 110 or 112 balls, something. And Kapil Dev had specifically spoken about that. And the papers were writing that Gavaskar was personally stung by this open criticism. It was not an open criticism, it was an implicit criticism. And Gavaskar was also running high temperature. He was constantly on medication all through that innings. His papers had written he was taking paracetamols and stuff like that. So he was mentally very strong because Gavaskar wanted to prove a point that he was also a one-day batsman, and he also wanted to go on a high, though it didn't eventually happen because we lost the semi-finals. But it was a good tournament for Gavaskar, considering that he was not exactly a one-day batsman to score a century, which he had never done in his entire career in one days, and also 250s, and to end up as the top scorer for India all through that series was great, because he started his career as the top scorer in that series in 1971. He ended his career both in tests as one day series as the top scorer. I mean, you can't have a better end. Though he didn't, the final hurrah was not a winning one. As a batsman, he practically did what was expected of him.
So, Sid, on that question, 2 things, right? You talked about Imran and Sunil Gavaskar, right? So, Sunil Gavaskar had announced his retirement from Test cricket at Lord's the year before, and he knew that Bangalore Test against Pakistan was the last. I mean, that's why he played the great innings. So the World Cup was obviously the last international tournament he was going to play. I don't think Imran had announced it, but it was understood that Imran wasn't playing beyond that. Winning a World Cup at Eden Gardens, Calcutta, was going to be the icing on the cake. Now, I think Bala was right about a couple of things. The India-Zimbabwe game, the needle in terms of the sunny couple thing, because India didn't want to go to Lahore and play the semi-final, because had we topped the pool A, we get to play in Bombay at Wankhede Stadium. If you were second, we had to go to the Gaddafi Stadium and play in Lahore, which we didn't want to play. I mean, you don't want to go to Pakistan, play a semi-final. The other interesting thing, I mean, two things, right? It's very interesting that the Gabba game from 85, when he smoked Ewan Chatfield a few times, that's interesting. And he played some terrific strokes in that Nagpur game. Yes, Fever was right, because a lot of times he was on his haunches, he was kneeling. I mean, you could see that he was visibly unhappy, and he was his health wasn't pink. But the other interesting thing, Sid, I mean, this is a bit conspiracy. There is no evidence. Sunil Gavaskar had stopped or had started to boycott Eden Gardens as a cricket venue, because ever since what happened in 83-84 against West Indies and then 84-85 against England, he had stopped playing. In fact, one of the reasons why when we played the 1987 Eden Gardens Test, I think Srikanth opened with Arun Lal because Gavaskar had pulled out. Imran won the toss and put India in because it was an inexperienced opening and he wanted to take some early wickets. So the World Cup final being slated for Eden Gardens, there was a talk that, there was a confusion whether Sunil Gavaskar was going to play. On one hand, there were people who said Sunil Gavaskar was very, very keen to play in the game and finish off his career. And as always, some of the Mumbai Mirror and a few other tabloids started to say that he would deliberately underperform at the Wankhede to let India not go there. I mean, I don't believe that holds any water. Sunil Gavaskar wouldn't do any such thing. But unfortunately, got out to Philip de Freitas, and as Bala said, he didn't get the final hurrah. So interestingly, yes, he proved a point to Kapil by scoring those quick runs. But the fact that there was some question marks about his availability for the Eden Gardens final was a very, very intriguing thing. And I still remember it was not in the press, but there were a lot of people in the town where I lived, Tuticorin, and few people were openly saying Gavaskar got out deliberately to stop India from getting to the finals. I don't believe that. Sunny, knowing Gavaskar as a cricketer, he wouldn't do such thing, but there were some whispers of that back then in India.
Interesting. So,
in fact, it was also reported in, I think it was reported in India today. I remember reading an article by Dilip Bob. It specifically talked of Gavaskar not wanting to go to Calcutta. And another conspiracy theory that particular article suggested was both the semi-finals. I mean, then again, it's a conspiracy theory. Nothing ever was really proved. Both the semi-finals were fixed by match fixers in India and Pakistan. And it was pretty well known in certain circles that India and Pakistan will not make it to the final. This was actually reported in India today. Dilip Bob wrote an article. I remember reading it. He was the deputy editor, and he used to cover cricket for them. And he specifically talked of it. I still remember the usage. The story that is gaining currency is that these matches were fixed. Of course, it can't be proved. Words to that effect. So those things were certainly mentioned in the press also. It was, as Vijay rightly pointed out, there were a lot of whispers among the fans also, but it was also reported. And there was an article in Sports World also, if I remember right.
So we've spoken about so many Indian batsmen that have come up, but the one Indian batsman who I associate with that World Cup hasn't come up yet, Navjot Sidhu.
Sixer
Sidhu, and it was such a big, for me, seeing Sidhu, and if you look at the stats now, he didn't hit like that many sixes. He hit good amount of sixes, but back then that was a big deal, the way, and I think Sidhu was also making a comeback right into the team.
Exactly. See, the particular match, very first match against Australia in Madras, that was a revelation for many of us to see Sidhu, because in Madras itself, we had seen Sidhu in this 1983 Test match against West Indies, where he was labelled as strokeless wonder by Rajan Bala. famous journalist for Indian Express.
And
Apparently-
I've heard that Sidhu took that clipping which said the strokeless wonder and he pasted it on his bedroom, and every morning he
Exactly.
used to wake up and he used to read
Exactly,
it. And he said, one day I will show Rajan Bala who I am, and he came back.
That's great. Very good of Sidhu to have done that, because we didn't expect Sidhu to be the kind of batsman he proved in that World Cup, because we never thought he had it in him. And it was not a one-off thing. He actually really did that. He was terrific against spinners, because I never seen anybody with a better footwork against spinners, because it was, I don't remember. A few times he would have caught, he could have been caught in the deep, not in the 87 World Cup subsequently, but his footwork against the spinners was precise, and most times it would come off. That very few, because it was not iffy. It was calculated, very precise, that both his footwork as well as the completion of the stroke was precise. And all through the tournament, he had, I think, 450s or something. He was very consistent. And you're right, he wanted to prove a point to Rajan Bala, and Rajan Bala wrote an article after that Chennai match, that he has proved me wrong or something, words to that effect. So that was very, very good on Sidhu.
Yeah, you're right, Sid. I think the moniker Sixer Sidhu was very popular, both in the Tamil or the regional press, vernacular press, as well as in the English press as well. You're right, he used to step out a lot. But again, I think Rajan Bala was right to call him a strokeless wonder. It's one thing to face in '83 in a test match, Malcolm Marshall, Joel Garner, Andy Roberts, and Michael Holding. Good luck in trying to hit them for sixes. In a one-day game against Peter Taylor or Greg Matthews, it's very different. So, look, I think Rajan Bala was right. He was a strokeless wonder throughout his career, but he was an excellent player of spin bowling. He showed that in the tournament. He played the spinners really well. And I would like to bring two other stories that happened after the tournament to prove how good he was against spin, right? I think when England toured India in 1993, he pretty much ended John Embury's career. John Embury was a good spinner. Even back in 84, 85, when he toured India, he took a lot of wickets along with Edmonds. He literally smoked him in that Bombay test in 93. Then a lot of people don't do that. I don't give credit to him. In the famous 1998 Chennai test, when Shane Warne and Sachin Tendulkar played for the first time, it was Navjot Singh Sidhu who took on Shane Warne first in the third innings, and then Sachin Tendulkar continued, and Warne recognizes that fact. So Sidhu was one of the very best players of spin India has ever produced. He wasn't a Brian Lara, but he was a really, really good player of spin bowling. But he had a bit of the Lara streak of stepping out and hitting bowlers for big sixes. And that proved to be very useful for India, because in that tournament, pitches were, some of them were dry and turning. Most sides employed 2 to 3 spinners. So playing in a spin Mohammad Azharuddin was a very good player of spin bowling. Vengsaka was good as well, but Sidhu's six-hitting ability was really, really helpful for India to control those middle overs.
And I remember 98, talking about 98, even like Ian Chappell on air was so impressed with Sidhu. He was saying he has a golf swing, and maybe once he retires from cricket, he can take up golf, because that's how clean that swing is when he used to come down the track against Shane Warne. So, a player like a commentator like Chappell, who himself was an excellent player against spin, being impressed must tell you something. So moving on to, so I guess the league stage, and very good points about Gavaskar. I remember the Nagpur innings, but I really missed my mind that he had made 2 other 50s and that he finished on a high. So maybe there is a bit of a narrative hole there that needs to be fixed in terms of how we perceive it as well. But one small thing about that Nagpur game was also the Chetan Sharma hat. That was again a moment that was again and again they had showed it on highlights, and Sharma was so elated after that 3rd wicket. I remember he just pumped his fist and he kneeled on the ground.
Yeah, that was kind of a redemption for him after this thing. At the time, Kapil Dev and Roger Binny were talked of, and Kapil Dev had backed Chetan Sharma to the hilt. So he was...
I guess there was a Haryana connection there as well.
Exactly. And he was not getting those wickets. Otherwise, apart from that hat-trick, he had a very average tournament otherwise. But this hat-trick was, I mean, purely from a spectator's point of view, it was pretty interesting because all the three were clean bowled. There was no confusion, nothing, no element of any doubt or anything. So, and if I remember, I mean, from my personal recollection, that was the first hat-trick that some of us had seen on a live television. I don't remember seeing, there was one hat-trick at the time of Jalaluddin. I don't think any of us would in India would have seen it, or I think, or was it after this or before that? I don't remember.
No, Jalaluddin was
83. Jalaluddin was 83. Jalaluddin was 83.
Okay. We read about it where none of us had probably seen it. This was probably the first hat-trick that we had seen it. So that was that much more interesting and great because of an Indian. And all the three were hat-tricks. I mean, clean bowl, I'm sorry. All the three clean bowled. So it was pretty good. And
if I remember, it was Jeff Crow, Chatfield, and one more, right?
Ian Smith. I think it's Ian Smith.
I don't think it was Jeff Crow. I think it
Ian
was.
Smith. I think it was Ian Smith, Chatfield.
Willie Watson.
Willie Watson.
Could be Willie Watson. Or was it Rutherford? Was Kenny Rutherford included? I'm not too sure.
In my memory, it was Rutherford, Ian Smith, and Willie Watson. And I
think Rutherford, Smith, and maybe Watson or Chatfield, one of those. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Chatfield. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
So on that, Sid, very interesting about Chetan Sharma, right? So Chetan Sharma was the next big thing of Indian fast bowling. And he took those 10 wickets in the third test. We won the Lords and Leeds test in 86 in England, the Edgbaston test. And he was the only Indian bowler to have ever taken 10 wickets then, or even till the 2000s, right, in England, in a test match. Now, I think he was considered Kapil's prodigy, but there was Manoj Prabhakar, right? And I mean, as the rumor mills would have it, there was a bit of a friction between Kapil and Manoj in terms of their styles and how they approach the game. And as Sanjay Manjrekar has written in his book, in which we have observed, Manoj Prabhakar was pretty much a quintessential Pakistani type cricketer, while Kapil and Chetan were more of the Indian type cricketers. And there was an accusation that Chetan wanted to bowl fast, but Kapil was more of a conservative, cut down the pace kind of a thing. And he wasn't allowed to express himself. But even this tournament, right, some games Kapil and Manoj played. I don't think there was any game where all the three played. So interesting. I mean, as I said, as Bala talked about, Chetan had that 1986 Australasia Cup final, Javed Mian, that six sitting on his shoulders like a monkey for a while. And I mean, I wouldn't say this was a redemption, but still, the fact that he helped India to win that game the way they had to within 42 overs. I mean, they bowled them out for 220 odd, and then Sunny Gavaskar played that brilliant innings. And we got there in 33 overs and got to play the home semi-final in Bombay. I mean, Chetan should be very happy about that.
One game that I want to talk about, especially because we haven't spoken much about Zimbabwe in this tournament. I mean, is that game in Hyderabad between Zimbabwe and New Zealand, where Dave Houghton played one of the great innings in that time. I mean, I think nearly an improbable target, and it was for me personally, of course, I was watching everyone for the first time, but to see Zimbabwe to see a batsman from Zimbabwe bat like that was quite something. And he was a very, very good batsman at that time, right?
Yeah. See, that match, I remember only catching the last few because I think I had a class to attend that day, and I came home pretty late. And towards the end only I started watching, and it was only at that time the Houghton was totally destroying the New Zealand bowling. I remember watching only the last 2-3 overs, and he was pretty much going after every ball of it. And he took a sensational catch of Martin Crowe. I think Martin Crowe's catch was decided as the best one of the entire tournament. We had the Bush company, this television company, electronics company, that was sponsoring the best catches of the tournament. I think the Martin Crowe's catch to dismiss David Houghton was declared as the best because he ran all the way back and took it somewhere long on or long off. I don't remember, long on or long off. But that innings was really special. I mean, what little I saw 2 or 3 overs, and subsequently I read a lot about it. He was clinical, and that was something that kind of, because Zimbabwe had won a interesting match against Australia in 1983. A lot was expected of Zimbabwe. Their fielding all through the tournament was terrific, and John Tricos as the captain was good, but they lost all the matches. They did well in patches, but they never won any of those matches. The batting was inconsistent. Bowling again was they couldn't manage it again in Indian conditions. That was pretty easy meet for the opposing batsmen.
Yeah, I think, Sid, I watched the game. That's one of the highlights of the tournament because that was the Fateh Maidan or the Lal Bahadur Shastri Stadium game. I still remember because they used to have the scoreboard at the ground level on one of the ends, which means when you see a batsman looking up, facing the ball, you could still see the scorecard or the manual scorecard. It's one of the unique grounds in India. So Martin Crowe played well, and I think David Houghton was a very, very good player with the spin bowling. I remember, I think they had three spinners, Stefan Bock, probably John Bracewell, and I don't know who the third spinner was. I think they had three spinners in the game, if not two. Bock and Bracewell, I don't know the third one. He swept, reverse swept, and the partnership, I still remember everyone was enamored by David Houghton. But I think the guy who scored a lot of runs was Ian Butchart, if I'm not 60-odd runs he scored after Houghton got it, even hit a six. I remember that day after watching the game when I went and played the street cricket, I called myself Ian Butchart. So it was such for a 10-year-old to watch a game like that and then to see Zimbabwe lose a close game with three runs was such an inspiring thing. And I'll tell you one more thing about Dave Houghton, right? Because you were right, the expectations were there, Bala, but you lose the game, and then I think they played Australia at the M.A. Chidambaram Stadium in Madras or Chennai now. So the Tamil news, the Doordarshan Tamil news, the Shobana Ravi, the famous newsreader, she read out saying, pretty much they were building up the game saying, you're watching Australia with Zimbabwe, but you get to see Dave Houghton bat. That kind of a build-up was there for a player from Zimbabwe. So he was almost a cult figure based on that innings because I wouldn't say it was a classic innings, a lot of sweeps and reverses, a lot of pyrotechnics were involved. And I think a lot of people felt bad that Zimbabwe lost the game. But it had such an impact. But I agree with Bala that I think somehow they didn't have the bowling attack. And I think there was a guy called Rawson, if my memory serves me right. He was pretty quick, Jeff Rawson or something. He had a bit of pace, but otherwise it was a very workman-like pedestrian team. They just competed there for numbers.
It was Peter Rawson, and Peter Rawson and Kevin Curran were the ones who reduced India to 17 for 5 in Tunbridge Wells. And after which Kapil came in. And a lot of the players who played in 83 also ended up playing. I think Butchart played in 83. Houghton was there, Rawson, Tricos. So that was, a lot of familiar names were there. But one thing that strikes me when I think of, Houghton and Lamb and a few others that we spoke of, maybe even Azhar at many parts, it was probably the last World Cup where you got to see so much of bareheaded batting and, where a few players chose to not wear helmets. And even if they wore the helmets, they wore the grill-less helmet. So you could still see the face. And even Gooch in the semi-final, I think Gooch probably hardly wore the grill anyway. But I think that the World Cup also had that element of where you remembered the batsmen's faces when they were going after. Houghton, it was the one thing in my memory is always, how that he was bareheaded for so much of the innings and he was just going crazy. And probably even wore a headband and Richards wore a headband against Sri Lanka as well. And that famous image is still stuck in my head as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that you remember people's faces through Doordarshan's telecast or something. That's amazing because most of the time we could barely make out the contours of the person batting or bowling. Talking of headboard, I think Ramesh Ratnayake used to bowl with a headband.
Oh, yes. Fantastic.
Ravi Ratnayake occasionally, not regularly, but incidentally, since Vijay pointed out Martin Sneddon, Ravi Ratnayake and Martin Sneddon, they opened the batting and bowling. I think they both opened the bowling and the batting in a couple of games for their respective teams. That's one of those few things in 1987 World Cup.
So Ravi Ratnayake was the Jayasurya before Jayasurya.
No, I think you're right, because the pinch hitters, right? Because Kapil used to open in a few games. I mean, later in the 80s, Ian Botham used to open the shoulders. And
Didn't Chetan Sharma open and get 100 or something?
Yeah, that was 89 Nehru Cup. Yes, against England. That was in Kanpur, correct. Now, coming back to helmets, I'll give an interesting point. Right? Yes, you're right. Most people used to, even Sachin Tendulkar in the 92 World Cup in the Dunedin game in New Zealand, right? He was helmetless for a while when he scored that 84, which was his then highest score. Now, coming back to that, wearing a helmet, not wearing a helmet, and Vivian Richards thinks it's a bit of a bravado not to wear a helmet, but he still wears a guard to protect his private parts. And I don't want to get into the Tony Greig's wife debate about whether you want to protect a head or testicles. That's a different debate. But let me come back to the point about helmets. Salim Yusuf was injured in that semi-final against Pakistan when Tosi ball, right? Had he worn that helmet, he wouldn't have been injured. It was a freak injury that he got a hit and he was out. And Javed Miander had to keep wickets for 20-odd overs. And to me, that could have been a difference between a 5 or 10 runs. So it's all fine and dandy to say that we didn't wear helmets and we were brave, etc. But when these things happen, you lose a match, you lose a semi-final. So since you talked about, I mean, I think your context was different, but I just want to bring about a topic that lack of helmets and how almost Pakistan lost out an opportunity because Salim Yusuf was injured in that semi-final when he was keeping to a spinner, Tawseef Ahmed.
Absolutely. And now that you
talking of pinch hitters, that semi-finals, McDermott was sent up the order as a pinch hitter, if I remember right. He came down 4 down or something.
Correct.
Yes, you're right.
So I think we haven't, on that, I would like to talk one thing. I mean, I had two, I wouldn't say guilty pleasure. I had two heroes who I wouldn't mention, but as a 10-year, Ian Butchart was one. The other guy was Mike Valletta. I mean, not many knew about him, but he was one of those flashy guys who would play some very nice innings. And I remember both in the semi-finals and finals, even in a game against Zimbabwe. So for me, the two heroes out of the World Cup were Ian Butchart from Zimbabwe and Mike Valletta. I mean, I think the Western Australian. And he played some, he used to play some very lovely shots, and he used to be a busy player, Mike Valletta. Not many would know about him.
Yeah, and he had a fantastic semi-final and final, right?
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
He was very diminutive and looked un-Australian in terms of pure looks because he had a moustache and he was short-statured. He was not a typical Australian in that sense. Of course, in terms of moustache, you had also David Boone and Alan Warder had a kind of this thing. He had a grizzly beard or something like that. But he was very un-Australian in his looks. And he was, as Vijay said, busy player. Busy is the operative word there. And both his innings they were terrific. I mean, that actually it was the difference between winning and losing. As he said, he's slightly underrated. But without his 2 innings, Australia would not have won both the semis and the finals. And of course, Steve was always there. But Michael Valletta's innings in both the finals and semis were the real clinchers.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about the semis because if you look at the history of one-day cricket, I think that particular game is probably up there for the biggest upset, I would say. I mean, upset not because Australia were a pathetic side or anything, but to go to Pakistan and play that Pakistan team, Imran's Pakistan, go to Lahore, and in that atmosphere, in an era where hardly anyone won in Pakistan, to win that game, that is like quite an achievement. And I mean, through the World Cup, one of the heroes for me was Jeff Marsh. And, I always used to, when I used to bat even few years later, I used to always try to bat like Marsh and Boone. I used to alternate between Marsh and Boone. And Marsh became a big deal for me in that World Cup. But yeah, through that, I mean, one thing that I read recently was that only Alan Border in that whole team had played in a World Cup before. So to take such an inexperienced team to Lahore and win, that must have been like a phenomenal achievement.
Alan Border was actually pretty low-key with his batting all through the tournament. David Boone and Jeff Marsh incidentally scored 2 centuries. The only guy to score 2 centuries in the tournament was Jeff Marsh. Both had 400 plus, and Dean Jones had around 300 plus runs. They were the main scorers. And of course, Steve Waugh came up, and they had interesting all-rounders. Steve Waugh, Simon O'Donnell, and Tom Moody. And Simon O'Donnell, in that particular match, in fact, he was fined after the match, if I remember right, for not participating in the team celebrations. But the story later, it came out pretty later that he was, at the time, he had come to know that he was suffering from, he had a lump around his rib cage. So he had known that he was having early stages of cancer. So he knew it, but he had not shared that detail with the team. He couldn't, he went to the tournament with that lump and this thing around the rib cage. And it came out a couple of days before that match. He had understood that that cancer had come. So he couldn't exactly participate in the team celebration, even though he had played and he was part of the team. So he was fined for not participating in the team celebration. Apparently, he told Simpson pretty later that he had, and he was kind of forgiven. Or at least, I mean, I don't know whether he was forgiven or not. That was how the story panned out sometime later. These things I read several years later. And this particular match, it as Vijay pointed out, that 18 runs that Steve was scored off the last over of Salim Jaffer, that proved to be pretty crucial. And Imran Khan was pretty much panned for his decision to go with Salim Jaffer for the final over, because there were other bowlers to go also, but why he chose Salim Jaffer is still a bit of a mystery. Of course, it is the captain's call. It can go either way. And another thing I remember from that particular match was the emotion in that stadium. Towards the end, the chants of Allahu Akbar from the Lahore stadium, and women holding placards saying, "We will miss you, Imran." That was genuine. I mean, the surge of emotions at that time was genuine, and it was interesting because we have not seen much of cricket from Pakistan before. And women chanting Imran Khan, even then he was a big star. He had a lot of sex appeal and stuff. But from Pakistan to see women going, "We will miss you, Imran," and chanting Allahu Akbar, that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, Sid, I think this is one game, in my opinion. I think Football World Cup has got much, I mean, for cricket, Test cricket is ultimate. So World Cups are not that important compared to Test cricket or Ashes. But Football World Cup, they chronicle it really, really well. I would like to compare the 1987 semi-final in Lahore to the very famous game that happened between Italy and Brazil in 1982 in Spain in Barcelona. Because that was a champion Brazil side with no defense, of course, and Serginho as a striker. The Italian side, thanks to a Paolo Rossi hat-trick, they happened to upset them and they went on to win the tournament. That game, I think still Jonathan Wilson has written about the game as a game where football lost its innocence, right? That was a day when the system succeeded against the flair and the favorite players of the world. I wouldn't call the Pakistani side of 87 cricket as a Brazil of 82 because Pakistan were mercurial despite having a lot of talents. But as everyone, I mean, as we've been talking about, the Australian side was pretty much, it was a work in progress transition, side in transition. To go to Lahore, and if I'm right, that was the first ever time Australia has beaten Pakistan in a one-day game in Pakistan. To do that in a World Cup semi-final, that takes a cake. So, and again, you're right. I mean, for me, that game was very interesting because first time we see a lot of games from Pakistan, they had segregated stands for women. They used to be called as ladies stands and used to be fully occupied by women from Lahore and other parts of Pakistan. And you're right. That's the first time I've ever heard religious chants in a cricket ground. Bala is right. Allahu Akbar, Pakistan Jeete Hai. I mean, I'm not very good in Hindi or Urdu. So those kind of chants, especially when Salim Yusuf walked back. I mean, Salim Yusuf was injured when he was keeping. Then when he came back to bat, when Abdul Qadir, who had already scripted an improbable win against the West Indies by hitting the six of Courtney Walsh, when they were batting, we knew that Pakistan was going to lose. But the crowds, you could see the energy in the crowds. I think there was almost a belief that this Pakistan side could move mountains. This Imran side, again, very important. It was not a Pakistan side, it was the Imran side. I mean, it was very different. Very subtle, very different. It was Imran's team. And there was no reason, there was no way Pakistan was going to lose in Lahore, but yet Alan Border's team did the improbable. So to me, that has to be one of the biggest upsets. And also, I think you need to say one thing. Dickie Bird was a very, very good umpire, but he made two mistakes I would like to point out in the semi-final because I watched every ball of the game. So we talk about Mushtaq Ahmed's googly in that 1992 World Cup final to Graham Hick. He beat him lock, stock and barrel, one of the best one-day deliveries to be bowled by a leg spinner. In that semi-final in 87, Abdul Qadir bowled an absolute peach of a googly, and Dean Jones had no clue about it. He was beaten lock, stock and barrel, and Dickie Bird for some reason didn't raise a finger. It was plumb hitting the middle of the middle. Then Pakistan were chasing, and after that early 3 wickets, 25 out for 3, and I think they had Mansoor Akhtar, Ramiz Raja, and Salim Ali got out. Imran and Javed Meyandad were building a partnership, and I think Imran went for a slog sweep of border and got, I think he had a top edge, or umpire Bird thought he had a top edge and caught by Greg Dyer, the keeper. I think Imran was a little shocked, and umpire raised a thing at Dickie Bird. But then later, Dickie Bird apologized to Imran, saying, you were nowhere close to the bat. Look, you can't blame umpiring decision, but those were two important decisions. But as I said, that one game of World Cup semi-final has to be chronicled more, because it was a great Pakistani side, red-hot favourites. Australia were rank outsiders. They went to the Lions' Den after playing all the games in India and beating Pakistan and Lahore in those days. That has to be the biggest upset, very close to the Brazil-Italy game from the 82 semi-final.
Yeah, talking about the reactions, I've seen an interview of Imran after that, and he says how it was, as if they were in the middle of a funeral at the end of the game. And everyone who came up to him, I mean, first of all, people were so hesitant to come up to him and talk to him because they saw the disappointment and in his face. But then even when his teammates, the manager and a few other people, when they had to talk to him, they came to him and they said, Imran, what happened? And he's like, you all saw what happened. You were all there. You were all, why are you asking me what happened? But he said that it was almost as if we were at a funeral, because that's what you go and ask people at a funeral. You say what happened, or you try and, commiserate with them. And just thinking of it, as a thought experiment, if Pakistan had won that game, which the odds were very high, and if they'd gone to Eden Gardens and beaten England in the final, do you think it would have been, I think it would have pretty much been the great farewell for Imran. And I wonder sometimes what would have happened in 92 then? Then would it have been Martin Crowe's year after all?
The possibilities are immense. You can always think on those lines. I don't know. You can still argue that England could still have put it past Pakistan in Eden Gardens, or Pakistan winning in the semi-finals would have impelled India to have played better against England in the semi-finals, and it could have been India versus Pakistan. Just a hypothetical situation. You can always say you can imagine it so. So you never know. And Gavaskar could have gone out on a high. He could have scripted an India's victory. I would like to think so, because having been a Gavaskar fan, I would like to think in that way.
Okay, so Sid, one other thing. I think as Bala is talking about conjectures and surmises and hypothetical situations. But let me put it this way. Yes, again, this is a World Cup podcast, and right? I love Test matches more. But one thing we would have missed out was the great Pakistan-West Indies Test series that followed the World Cup in 1987-88. Because had Imran won the World Cup in Eden Gardens in 1987, he would have probably retired, wouldn't have come back. Because to me, the Test series between West Indies and Pakistan in 1988 that was played out has to be one of the very best. Unfortunately, it was not televised. It was, it was a series that Pakistan should have won, if not for some dicey umpiring decisions. But some great Vivian Richards, Imran stories. There were so many subplots and storylines and narratives. That series wouldn't have played out the way it was, because had Imran not been there, Pakistan wouldn't have competed that much. And then, of course, as you said, 1992 World Cup. But again, these are conjectures and hypothetical situations which we could go on and on.
Yeah, of course. I was not trying to get too serious here. I just keep wondering, the what ifs of cricket scenarios, not just this. There are so many in cricket that just throws it up. So going from Lahore to Bombay, as it was back then, and Ravi Shastri and Maninder Singh somehow focusing on the outside the leg stump line, which I think back then also was quite inexplicable why they were constantly doing that. And Graham Gooch, as the headline went, swept them out of the semi-final.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has pointed out, because right from start, the toss and the conditions were overcast, and Kapil thought it would swing, and he thought it would be in favor of the bowlers. But purely from a general point of view, we should have batted first. I mean, that was the general belief. We didn't do that. And as Vijay pointed out right at the start, Venksankar pulling out of the last moment was a major blow for Indian team. And we didn't have a plan B. Kapil's captaincy in that entire match, and of course his batting, came under a lot of criticism much later. But his captaincy was inexplicable. There was no plan B at all. See, after Gooch and Gatting got together and began sweeping, the bowlers were totally clueless, and the fielding placements were also, I mean, we were able to see they were sweeping, and there was no real protection for such a shot. That was totally, when I look back, it beggars belief that how can something of this, this was pretty much schoolboy stuff from a captain and a fielding team. And in our batting too, even after all this, even after Kapil got out, towards the end, we were still around, say, for the last 10 overs with 5 wickets in hand, we had just around 51 or 52 to get. And I think Azhar was still at the crease. I don't know. I don't know. We could have still managed, because there was Kiran More, there was Ravi Shastri. Ravi Shastri had a very poor tournament for India, because he had a terrific the 85 World Championship of Cricket, and the tight test was practically his, because he shepherded the batting tail, and he was the real standout performer in the chase. But he had a very ordinary tournament for India, Ravi Shastri. Both his bowling as well as batting never really came through. So this particular match, the semi-finals, I still remember, because Kapil's batting, and he hit Eddie Hemmings, that sweep shot, and Gatting openly criticized that was a silly shot to play at that moment. Words to that effect. He said that after the match. For an opposing captain to spell it out, that was pretty interesting.
Quite ironical, considering what happened a few days later.
What happened after that, exactly. I mean, karma is a bitch. It came to bit him back in his back. That's how I remember that particular match.
Sid, I think two things, right? One, Pakistan got knocked out. Yes, from a cricketing perspective, it was a big loss, because Imran's side deserved to be in the final, but being an Indian, you didn't want to face Pakistan, because Pakistan had started to become the nemesis of India, or the bugbear or the boogeyman for India in the 85 to 87 period, by beating India in India, as well as in Sharjah and other places. So we were very happy that Pakistan lost the semi-final in Lahore. But I still remember there was a thought before the semi-final as a 10-year-old, was India was going to win the World Cup again, because we almost thought that we were going to beat England, because in Bombay, Wankhede Stadium, and then we can beat Australia, because you never thought Australia was a great side. But again, Bala brought up an important point about Kapil Dev winning the toss and inserting the opposition. But I think in that tournament, if my memory serves me right, a lot of captains were doing it because the starts were early, because it was October, November, which means it was winter technically in India, which means you had to start those games around 9 o'clock, which means early starts, any bit of moisture. It's not a test match, right, where you can leave the ball and, play out the first session. Here, if you lose a couple of wickets, it could be a difference between winning and losing. So I think Kapil put them in. I think, as I pointed out, Dilip Venksankar was a loss. I think the most inexplicable thing about the spin bowling was, apparently everybody in the journalistic community knew that Graham Gooch was practicing for sweep shots for the 2-3 days prior to the semi-final. And all the net bowlers, all the left-arm net bowlers, they had kept on bowling to him on the off-stump, outside and all. I don't know. Whether there were spies from the Indian team on the England camp, I don't know, right? But Bala was right. But before Bala, what Bala said about Kapil, about the game was right, his captaincy. But in my personal view, I watched Kapil very closely on TV for a long time. to me, he was the most overrated Indian cricket captain. See, the 1983 happened. That is one of those black swan events or whatever you call it. It happened, right? But Kapil was never tactically smart. He was a good, well-meaning, all-round cricketer with a lot of natural talent. But to call him a great captain was a travesty, which is done by a lot of business schools because we won a World Cup. That's a problem, right? We equate an outcome to a lot of series of events. But anyway, that's my personal view. I think I think one of the things, Bala talked a lot about how India capitulated to the spin. One striking memory of the game was Mohammad Azharuddin was batting really well. I think he scored 64. And I think the Sports Star that published it the next year or the day after, Azhar got out to a paddle sweep, right? We talk a lot about the reverse sweep. David Houghton played it, Javed Miandad played it, Michael Gatting played it in the finals and lost a wicket. But paddle sweep was not that common, right? Because paddle sweep was, Azhar was kind of playing well. And the great thing about the picture that Sports Star, the magazine, published was Azhar's tongue would be sticking out to the right. I'm just trying to rehearse it in my mind. I think he was playing the sweep, and the tongue was to his right, sticking out, and the ball hit him, and it was a straight ball, he missed it, and Eddie Hemmings, the wily off-spinner, got him out. And so, like, we criticize a lot, but paddle sweep wasn't that common. I mean, in one-day cricket they were playing, but in Test cricket, again, Azhar was the one guy who got out in the Hamilton Test of '94, and that didn't allow India to win a Test match 7 years later. So he got out of paddle sweep. After that, there was a fair bit of panic, and Chandrakant Pandit got out. And also the other interesting thing, slow balls, right? Somehow there is this myth that Steve Waugh and Simon O'Donnell were the pioneers of the slow ball in the 80s. I remember Neil Foster bowled a couple of good slow balls. I mean, as Bala pointed out, Doordarshan coverage wasn't good enough to pick a lot of those things like the Channel 9 or the BBC One. Neil Foster used to bowl. And in that game, if I'm right, Neil Foster bowled a couple of good slower balls. And it was a bit confusing. And Bala was very right. India didn't have a plan B. Once we lost Dilip Vengsarkar, once Graham Gooch assaulted the Indian spinners out of the game, we simply, lambs for slaughter, and we caved in and we lost the game meekly. Very disappointing, because that was a game. Had India won, I believe India would have won the World Cup final. It was a big missed opportunity, especially after Pakistan losing in Lahore the day before. India should have won the game and should have gone on to compete at the Eden Gardens. That was a big missed opportunity, very disappointing one at that.
So moving on to Eden Gardens, I mean, it's interesting about this semi-final. I just quickly went to the scorecard now, and I saw that England scored 254. But again, the narrative of Gooch is so large, I guess, because the English have, made that the central focus, that you somehow think that, they made closer to 300 or 300 plus. 254 was a good score at that time, I think. But, for an Indian team playing at home with such a batting lineup, I would think was still achievable and under those conditions. And as you mentioned, they did get close. I mean, with Azhar batting, and Azhar was a fantastic one-day batsman, and Azhar batting, and, even if you take out Pandit, still, with Kiran More, who was a very, very handy batsman, Prabhakar, who could bat, Chetan Sharma, who could bat. I mean, I think they could have got there, but the one thing with England in that World Cup was, similar to what we are talking now of England, was the depth. They had these very interesting players, even De Freitas, who could bat, who also could come in and make that quick 15-20 runs. Then you had Embury, who also was a handy batsman as well as a bowler. And then you had, one of the players who I always remember from that World Cup is Gladstone Small. And, we always used to try and bowl like him, because he had this slightly, the shoulder and the neck didn't have much of a gap. So, always try and imitate him and bowl like him. So Small ended up being an interesting player for them as well. So moving on to the final in Eden Gardens, Australia, England, of course, again, a very, very, I would say, sort of attritional battle, and not either team, you couldn't say either team was on top at any point of time. It was seesaw throughout. And then, of course, Gatting gets blamed for it. But I think even after Gatting's wicket, England were well in with a chance. I think even towards the end, when De Freitas was batting and with a few other tail-enders, a few big hits and they could have still made it beyond the finish line, right?
After Gatting's wicket, Allan Lamb's and Steve cleaned him up. That was because as long as Allan Lamb was there, there was still hope because he had won two matches before. And towards the end, he was the most crucial player. But once Steve took him out, it was pretty much in Australia's way. But still, England kept going, and eventually it was only 7 runs, which still remains the closest World Cup final. In a final, you to score over 250 plus, that kind of set it up for Australia because it was a final, and the 250 score was the threshold at that time. 250 was kind of the match was more or less in your back, and to do that in a final, and that was a good start. And Boone had a terrific match. Boone did well. Valletta did well. Dean Jones had a decent game. So that batting 250 effort was the one which really set it up. Bill Athey was underrated. I mean, he had a very good series against Australia in Australia. The previous Ashes, where England had a terrific run in Australia, one of the best performances in Australia. Bill Athey was a kind of a revelation in that series. Chris Broad, unfortunately, had a very average outing in this World Cup. In fact, they had to replace him with Tim Robinson halfway through because he didn't have a good run. It was much left to Gooch. The match was more or less in Australia's favor. But the eventual result, 7 runs, would make it to be a very close affair.
I think, in the two, Steve Waugh, of course, when you talk of Steve Waugh in the World Cup, there is always that image now of, the Herschel Gibbs drop and the 99 World Cup and all that. But I think Steve Waugh delivered two of the most important balls for Australia in World Cups. One was the Allan Lamb wicket in the 1987 World Cup final, which was quite a brilliant ball to get him out. And then that ball to Lara in the 1996 semi-final, which again was one of the best balls of that World Cup, and which got them to win that game and sort of go to the final. I think those two balls by Steve Waugh need a bit to be highlighted much more than they are.
So, being an Ian Chappell fan, I'm not supposed to say too many positive things about Steve Waugh. So, since you're talking about his bowling, I'll talk about it because I'm not going to talk too much about his selfish batting because that'll create a bit of a problem for a lot of New South Wales where I live. So, yes, I think those two balls are very important, especially the Lara one in Mohali was an absolute peach bowling around the wicket, coming around the wicket, and it just moved off the seam, and Lara was really surprised that he got out. And as Bala said, the 87 final against Allan Lamb was very important as well. Now, coming back to your question about 1987, I mean, finals, I want to bring one more topic. You kind of alluded to, Sid, that English press have made Gooch bigger than for the sweeps than it is. I think we need a bit of context. I think the sweep has to be called out because Abdul Qadir played 2 games against England. They had Gooch, who's a very good player of spin, in absolute knots because Abdul Qadir had them up in knots, right? So they had struggled a fair bit against spin. And everyone knew that Wankhede being in a little bit of, a slow pitch, spin would play a big part. If you had watched the game, spin was a big thing because Kapil was really clueless because Gooch was sweeping from outside the off stump. He was sweeping from outside, from the stumps, as well as then he forced Maninder and others to chaotic things. Then they started the ball short and wide outside the off stump. So it completely upset them because, again, as you would know, India is a land of playing spin very well, but Indian players don't employ spin that much, sweep very much, right? So this is a bit of a surprise. And as Pala pointed out, Kapil didn't move the fielders. It took a while for him to understand that he had to protect that side, right? So coming back to the finals, the England's finals, I think the one big thing was the crowds. People thought maybe people would not show up. Maybe it won't be a 90,000 plus. Maybe it won't be 100,000 crowds. But in the end, we had a very big crowd. I mean, I don't think it was a full house, but 85, 86,000 people showed up for an Australia-England final on a Sunday, and they stayed on till the end for the celebrations. And also one thing I remember, I think it's a small bit of anecdote, the TV coverage we talked about. I remember, I think it was Eddie Hemmings who bowled, and Dean Jones hit him a 6. So the commentator was on Doordarshan, Narottam Puri. So he hit the ball and Narottam Puri said, it's a 6. But the camera never went to cover the ball. So we saw the batsman hitting. The camera work wasn't there to cover the ball going all the way to the mid-wicket or long on where it went. So even for a 1987 World Cup final, the TV coverage was pretty poor. The other interesting thing what I mean, a lot of people miss out. Neil Foster bowled one of the spells of his life. I think for the first 8 overs, he conceded only 12 runs. I think it was absolutely immaculate, swung the ball a bit, and he bowled on a penny. I think in the last 2 overs, they took him for 20-odd runs. So those are, I mean, again, as I said, the Mike Valletta thing, Neil Foster, who bowled a very good 8-over spell, and then that Alan Border coming in bowling and taking out Mike Gatting of Greg Dyer's catch. I mean, there was some very, and Bill Latty, I mean, we talked about Bill Latty. If I'm right, he was run out 58 or 57. He got run out in that final. So yeah, and Craig McDermott. I think we haven't mentioned Craig McDermott's performances, because both in the semi-finals and finals in the first game against India in Madras, he was lion-hearted. A lion-hearted Queenslander. He bowled really, really well. I think Roger Binney took 18 wickets as the highest wicket taker in the 1983 World Cup in England. In 87, if I'm right, it was McDermott who was the highest wicket taker with 18 wickets. So I think one has to give a lot of credit. Bruce Reid did all right because he took Javed Miandad out in the semi-final in Lahore. But Reid was there or thereabouts. But Craig McDermott was magnificent in that World Cup for Australia.
And back then he was quick too, right? Compared to say 92 when he was still very good, but not as quick.
Yeah, he was the Billy the Tiger. Before he made his debut, Australia Border had said he will let loose the tiger on, I think that was against West Indies or so, I think, in the series sometime in Australia. He said he will let loose his tiger on the opponents. And McDermott, as Vijay rightly pointed out, he had a terrific World Cup. To get 18 wickets in India was terrific. And he had a couple of good batting outing also. As we mentioned, we talked of his pinch hitting in the semi-finals also. He came 4 down. So McDermott, Steve bowling, because that was the first time we saw Steve slower run from the back of the hand. That is the first time people were hearing about it. I mean, these days it's pretty common. It was we saw it with Steve. He came of age as a death bowler in that World Cup.
In those days, it was Doordarshan coverage. I mean, I'm not sure how many people know about the story. So BBC was showcasing World Cup games back in the UK, and Channel 9, and then there's no cable or pay TV, right? Channel 9 was I don't think they showcased every game, but they showed the final between England and Australia. This is a story that was reported by Mike Coward, and he has talked about it, and even Alan Border has acknowledged, so it must be true. So I got to believe it. So 87 was a Sunday game, a final. So as a morning game in India, which would have been Sunday afternoon. So Australian people on Channel 9 got to watch the game to see their side score 253. When the England chase began, it was a Sunday evening. Channel 9 said, who bothers about a 1987 World Cup coming from Eden Gardens, India? They said, let's switch off cricket, and they changed to a movie, a Sunday afternoon movie. I don't know exactly remember the movie. So basically, the Sydney and Melbourne, where 40% of the Australian population lives, they didn't get to see their team winning their first ever World Cup because Channel 9 felt, who cares about a World Cup from India? Now, again, I want to bring this topic because in India, we have a lot of condescensions towards England and the way they've snubbed Indian cricket. Somehow we don't do the same thing to Australia and West Indies when they do it to us. I mean, this is Australia's problem, but this is something Mike Coward has passionately talked about. I bumped into him at an Ashes test a couple of years ago at the SCG, and we talked about this incident as well, and he mentioned that as well. So that's very interesting. So Australian public, they didn't get to see their side winning the tournament. Despite it was available on a Sunday afternoon, they decided to show an American movie at that time.
Doordarshan cameramen were apparently bribed or influenced by certain companies to show their billboards during the telecast. These days, they officially do that because you pay them as an official sponsor, and they focus on the particular company's billboard. They were privately bribed or influenced to show and that was a huge controversy after the World Cup. And some of the Doordarshan staff were suspended after that. I remember reading about it.
Bala, even though the 87 World Cup and that whole team, Alan Border's team from the mid-80s, even though it may be not as well remembered in Australia, I think in India and especially in Madras, it's still very fondly remembered, right? And
certainly.
The tight test and that one-run victory and the World Cup victory.
Exactly. See, Vijay was really spot on, because everything that took off from the Australian cricket really took off from that tight test. And Mike Howard, who has been to India several times in the 80s and later in the 90s, he's the one who has written about it. He is really specifically, he comes to the point that Madras set it up for Australia. And in Chennai itself, Dean Jones is a big thing. You can still go around the bylines of triplicate. All people will still recall his innings. That was a big innings. Fond memories, obviously, because Chennai crowd generally has a tendency to fall in love with the opposing players. That was specific players, not all players, specific players. Dean Jones for one, Steve O for another. And Chennai, Australia had another interesting match in Chennai pretty much in 1996. New Zealand versus Australia quarterfinal. That was a terrific match, wonderful Markwa century, 1996. So Australia will always find Chennai very interesting position, but of course, the later day test matches were not all that kind to them, especially two Tendulkar centuries taking away the match from them.
But they were still classics.
Classics, absolute classics. Those test matches were greater than, sometimes as close as tight test itself. Because as Vijay pointed out, tight test match, it's very difficult to recall. We all have to dig into our personal memories to come up, because we don't have any archival material to go back to and watch them. It's very difficult. We have to look at reports and our own personal memories. So in that sense, tight test is slightly watered down in our memories, in our personal memories. So these later day test matches, which had better coverage, will always seem much more interesting, purely from the availability of footages. One person's name we should be talking about, we should have NKP Salve. Without him, this tournament would not have happened, 1987, because he was the man behind it. Because apparently, everyone knows the story. He was snubbed, he couldn't get 2 tickets in 1983. That really started it off. So NKP Salve, he really plotted this, the way he went about working behind the scenes, trying to win over the associate nation. The votes of the associate nations is what brought the World Cup to India, because India and Pakistan promised a lot of money for the associate nation. They had around 26 votes or something. That was the clincher, because England was not ready to give in to India and Pakistan hosting it. The 26 votes of the associate nation. So apparently they were supposed to get around 3,000 pounds per match, or from the entire tournament. I don't remember what, if England had hosted. India and Pakistan promised 20,000 pounds to the associate nations.
So thanks so much for joining us on another edition of the 81 All Out podcast. It was great fun talking about the 1987 World Cup. And we are looking forward to bringing you more nostalgic posts on other World Cups. You can follow us on iTunes, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcast. Please leave a review on iTunes if you like us. It helps people to find us when they do a search of cricket podcasts. And you can follow us on Twitter at 81allout, and you can go to our site at 81allout.com.
In the air, Srishan takes it! India win! He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for 2.